I think the discussion in the morning were very, very interesting and at least for me, extremely illuminating. You can spend a lot of time in the secretariat and only know what you know until you hear from those who are observing you from outside. So I want to appreciate the presentations that were made in the morning and after tea break. We want to build on that and have a session that combines the experience of former chairs of the scientific committee and former executive secretaries. And I will be taking notes so that I enrich my understanding of the council. I hope you too will have something new to learn. This panel is going to be chaired by Professor George Kobou. Above everything else, Professor George Kobou is a former vice president of CODESRIA, and I had the privilege of serving on that executive committee. So George, I hand it over to you. Please try to keep it within 2 hours. When you see me hovering around here, you will know that I'm becoming jittery. So welcome and looking forward to listening to the panel.
Merci beaucoup, Godwin. Je sais que l'heure n'est pas encore au bilan, mais je voudrais d'entrée de jeu profiter de l'opportunité qui m'est donnée pour d'abord te dire merci et te féliciter pour le leadership que tu incarnes depuis que tu es à la tête du CODESRIA et aussi pour le leadership que tu as incarné avec cette assemblée générale de Home que tu as organisée et que je vois vraiment comment avec toute ton équipe tu déploies tout. Vraiment, félicitations. Je sais que ce n'est pas encore l'heure du bilan, mais je profite de l'opportunité que j'ai pour dire vraiment saluer ce travail merveilleux. Ça fait depuis quelques jours que nous sommes là. Je trouve des travaux riches, des panels riches, des réflexions riches, et c'est tant mieux comme ça. Alors, c'est vrai, nous sommes en train de fêter le 50e anniversaire. 50 ans. 50 ans, c'est l'heure de la sagesse, c'est l'âge de la sagesse. Et bien entendu, quand on a de la sagesse, on sait toujours, c'est comme un conducteur. Lorsqu'on est sur la route, si le conducteur ne regarde que devant lui, il aura des problèmes parce que c'est toujours bien de regarder au rétroviseur parce qu'en voyant d'où on vient, on sait mieux là où on va. Et je crois que le CODESRIA n'a pas dérogé à ce principe. Parce que quand je vois déjà depuis ce matin, cette journée-ci, on a vu comment ceux qui ont incarné depuis un certain temps l'institution ont, de leur autorité, essayé de retracer le parcours qui va encore suivre. Et c'est tant mieux. Et je vois qu'au CODESRIA, le CODESRIA sait bien célébrer les siens. Le CODESRIA sait bien célébrer ceux qui ont donné la voie à suivre. Et bien entendu, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, quand on s'avance en regardant derrière nous, on va voir mieux on va. Et le panel de cet après-midi est un peu la continuation de ce principe. Ça veut dire quoi? Que ici, nous avons des personnes qui ont structuré le CODESRIA depuis un certain temps. Et je vais commencer par Madame, je sais que j'ai prononcé, c'est Takyiwaa. Excusez-moi, je sais que tu n'es pas japonaise. Je ne sais pas pourquoi ils ont écorché ton nom, mais ce n'est pas grave. Qui a été directrice de l'Institut des études africaines à l'Université du Ghana et qui a été présidente du comité scientifique du CODESRIA au cours des dernières années. Madame la Présidente, soyez les bienvenus parmi nous. Pas encore. J'ai introduit d'abord. Et bien entendu, il y a deux baobabs qui sont là, qui vont le suivre. Souvent, je ne sais pas, je dis toujours que je ne sais pas comment introduire Bayo. Parce que il est à la fois quoi? Un chercheur, un intellectuel, un leader, un manager, je ne sais pas, un tout. Bon, je crois que dans la posture que nous avons tracée en disant qu'on sait d'où on vient, on sait, il faut savoir là où on va. Et je crois que Bayo fait partie, c'est bien de l'avoir pensé ici, qu'il va certainement, comme la thématique c'est quoi? C'est la mise en œuvre de l'agenda scientifique panafricain. Et le grand panafricaniste qu'il est, le grand intellectuel qu'il est, il va certainement trouver les axes pour pouvoir nous aider à poursuivre tout ce qu'on a commencé ce matin. Je veux dire que depuis que j'ai connu le CODESRIA à la fin des années 90, j'ai connu un Bayo très déterminé, très déterminant, et qui aujourd'hui d'ailleurs n'a pas varié d'un iota par rapport au Bayo que j'ai connu il y a longtemps. Ça veut dire que c'est quoi? Moi qui suis un peu mathématicien, je crois qu'on va lui donner le nom d'une identité remarquable. Ça veut dire quelque chose qui est invariant. Et bien entendu, les circonstances dans lesquelles je l'ai connu, c'était avec Ebrima, ici présent, qui aussi a incarné beaucoup l'institution. Et il va de soi que ce n'est pas un hasard que c'est lui qui a remplacé Bayo comme secrétaire exécutif. Et nous sommes encore dans la mouvance de la continuité. Je suis convaincu que l'intervalle de temps que nous allons avoir ici pour pouvoir mettre en œuvre le nouvel agenda, ou bien l'agenda panafricain pour les 50 années à venir, pourquoi pour ne pas dire pour le siècle à venir, ça va être bien structurant avec ces trois personnalités importantes du CODESRIA. Alors, Madame la directrice, Madame la vice-présidente, Madame la présidente, pour ne pas donner encore appeler le chinois, il vaut mieux que je dise que je donne le floor à Madame la présidente.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I know it's hard for us to stay awake after lunch, but well, we have to pay for it. So I'm here to join in this panel on implementing a Pan-African research agenda in my capacity as a former president of the scientific committee. And I would like to start, like most people who have spoken before me, by congratulating CODESRIA on this 50th anniversary. Many people have claimed all kinds of kinship with CODESRIA as sons or daughters, or Marima came up with what, aunts of CODESRIA. I really do not know which kind of kinship I would claim, but I would say that CODESRIA has been an intellectual home for many of us. And a home is not always a happy place. A home, there are hierarchies in homes, there are conflicts and contestations in homes, but it's still a place you go to at the end of the day. And then I think that the recounting of the 50-year history, particularly the very last panel, has brought out some of the issues, the still unresolved issues in CODESRIA, which we hope will merit attention. I also want to express my thanks to the executive secretaries over the time and the secretariat for the work that they have done, and also to this executive secretary and the secretariat for the invitation. Over the last few days, we've heard a lot, but one of the things that really pleased me was the opening ceremony and the participation of the Foreign Minister of Senegal, and himself a member of the CODESRIA community, Professor Manuh, especially in light of the continuing and in some cases deepening anti-intellectualism around the continent. And I think that Senegal has been rightly celebrated for its welcome to CODESRIA and its ideas and the support that it has rendered to CODESRIA over the years. Now, when we think of the birth of CODESRIA, I like to situate it within a period of crisis, the African crisis, with 1973, with the debt crisis, and the militarisms around Africa, and our universities in crisis. And CODESRIA broadly, even though later on there was an SOS African history, I like to think of CODESRIA as an SOS for African universities, particularly around the time of its birth. So what CODESRIA has meant and continues to be is a scholarly home for many of us that provides an alternative to the stultifying environments on many of our campuses. And the achievement of CODESRIA has been the creation of an African scientific community and community of researchers who consist of people not just on the continent, but also from the new and old African diasporas. I'm talking about our links to the active membership of colleagues from the Caribbean and the USA, especially the Black communities there, the communities of color, but increasingly also the African intellectuals who have relocated to the US and Europe and other places, and who maintain various kinds of transnational existences and a very deep interest and involvement in the work of CODESRIA. As many people have recounted, CODESRIA has been, or the colleagues within CODESRIA have proven or become mentors to many younger scholars. It has created several networks. People have mentioned their participation in national or multinational working groups, the development of green books, benefiting from small grants for thesis writing, the books and journals support, etc. And long before open access as a policy really took place, CODESRIA implemented an open access policy that allowed scholars to publish and also to access publications. And this is particularly significant when we consider the rise of predatory journals, which require people to pay to publish. And in many of our universities, unless you have papers in so-called international journals, your promotion and other prospects become jeopardized. So we've also spoken a lot about CODESRIA's role in developing African and decolonized knowledges and perspectives, the issue of language, and just either going online or going down to the book display and looking at the CODESRIA book series and their titles. They reflect both the preoccupations and realities of social life on the continent. I went through some of the General Assembly themes and panels over the years, and I just want to share some of them with you. So in the 1992 General Assembly, the theme was on democratization processes in Africa, problems and prospects. And as we know, this was soon after the national conferences and the general multi-partyism and opening up of no-party or one-party systems around many of our countries. In 1995, the theme was on crisis, conflicts, and transformation. In 1998, it was on globalization and the social sciences. In 2002, the General Assembly was on Africa in the new millennium. In 2005, it was rethinking development. In 2008, it was on governing the public sphere in Africa. In 2011, it was on Africa and the challenges of the 21st century. 2015, creating African futures, challenges and prospects. And in 2018, it was on Africa and the crisis of globalization. So as you can see, these themes, of course, this does not mean that these were the only papers that were issues or papers that were presented, but they reflect what was current in Africa at the time. And I think that the theme of this General Assembly has also reflected very much what has happened and the repercussions and the insistence by many of the presenters that this is not new, that what it did, what the COVID-19 crisis or pandemic has done has been to lay bare even more the situations in our countries and just the emptiness of the development models that we have been operating. Now, what has also happened over time is that in many of our countries, the political situation has changed and it has opened up space for debate in several of our countries. Above all, what CODESRIA has done is that it has allowed us to think from where we are, to really reflect on ourselves as Africans and, you know, the issue of positionality, the issue of perspective, and of both common global problems and specific African issues, and in the process, begin to think about how we make theory and the place of theory in our scholarship. And as some of our interlocutors informed us, it is important for us to be informed by, but not shackled by, past scholarship. So it's important to know where we've come from and how this informs where we are going. So in our opening ceremony and the session on grounding the debate, issues around crisis and disruptions, etc., were put center stage, and they were reflected in both at the global, the national, and local levels. So in terms of the Pan-African research agenda, and in this panel, we are not being asked about formulating it, but really about implementing a Pan-African research agenda. But of course, to identify the agenda, as I've said, it has been important to proceed from the realities of research and social life on the continent. And we know that this has informed the different vehicles that CODESRIA has used so far, whether it's from the different institutes, the Pan-African doctoral training programs across the different sub-regions and disciplines, through to the African Humanities program, etc. What has happened is that CODESRIA has made attempts to overcome the low research output and then low graduate training. And it has borne fruit, as again, we have heard in several of the interventions. But we know that all these can be augmented in several ways. We were also reminded forcefully of the reality of new actors. So whereas when CODESRIA started, universities were largely in crisis and very few people were really interested in knowledge production on Africa and in Africa. Right now, there are several policy think tanks, there are several civil society organizations, and the rise in the use of international consultants, especially by our governments, who, and many of these consultants often do not ruffle the feathers, but they earn huge sums, even though there are several local intellectual and grounded outputs that do not get any support from many of our governments or even some of the donor agencies. So in terms of possible directions, I think that, yes, we still do very relevant research, but it is important that we build or resuscitate the tradition of a conscious linkage between research and social and continental relevance, not in the sense of instrumental research, which will have a section at the end on policy or social relevance, but really working to produce the next generation of researchers and social actors that see the continent not as a country, but to view the continent as a unit of analysis and frame of reference, and the primary, though not exclusive, source of interlocutors. A lot has been said about the beginnings of CODESRIA, and and in fact, there was a contention that too much attention has been paid to economics and not enough to cultural issues. But what some have described as a somewhat mechanical approach to political economy has within CODESRIA and leading to some reductionism exists. However, over the past several years, a broader and open interpretation of African societies have emerged, and we take seriously the diversity of the sources of our post-colonial statecraft. We've also heard a lot about the attention and the influence of gender scholarship within CODESRIA, although it has also been described as a work in progress. Issues of sexuality, etc., has also come up, and both gender and sexuality have become the mainstay of many serious analysis of African societies, cultures, and contestations, and they are no longer just seen as epiphenomenal. But it could also be argued that in the process, there has been some relegation of political economy and foundational categories of and questions. And indeed, I would say that a lot of the work on the economy, CODESRIA has ceded the ground to a number of neoliberal creations, and we see it all around in the kinds of analysis that they make of our societies and the teaching that our students receive. So for instance, at the University of Ghana, development economics, which was a mainstay, is no longer taught at the Department of Economics. So it is, for me, I think it is important that we foreground some of these basic questions of political economy and bring and center it in the analysis of African societies and also in the kind of research that we do. This also relates to the question of the African youth and the future of Africa. Every week we are hearing about, the hopelessness that drives the youth to leave Africa. And when we really put this against the youth bulge across our continent, these numbers are still low. But in addition to the youth, we also have some of our most educated leaving the continent towards an aging West. And we need to go back to the moment of our structural adjustment programs and what the current exodus and hopelessness portends. We also have in many of our societies now a crisis of governance and extremisms in social relations. For instance, there is a new raft of legislation that seeks to decide what people do in their bedrooms, and it's indicative of a tilt towards social relations that centralize power. And these things are happening in our countries, in Uganda, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in a whole number of places. And we know that the dangers are continental in reach, and that it would need that we mobilize to transform the continent and achieve a minimal Pan-African project. So research has to again grapple with questions of power and their implications for society, as well as the capacity to produce knowledge in a renewed context of threats to academic freedom from states. There is also the question of social relevance and funding, and it has been reiterated that we need to return to the basic concerns of organic scholarship in Africa. We know that increasingly many of our colleagues have become extremely careerist, and research designs are drawn up with little linkage to a transformational project, even at a national level. So the question is, what would it take to have a critical intellectual project that at the same time aspires to be part of social transformation? We've heard a lot about funding and African-funded research, and the question is, where is it to come from? And I think in the last panel, we heard quite a bit about revisiting the CODESRIA Endowment Fund and also targeting high net worth individuals on our continent who have money to give away everywhere else but in Africa. So how may these new directions be arrived at and implemented? I see that even though we are a scientific organization, very little has been said about the scientific committee, even though it exists. And Georgie mentioned the 2015 reforms and the reports that were produced. And I remember, as a former president of the scientific committee, responding to some questions and other members of the scientific committee on the mandate of the scientific committee. And I believe that many of the issues raised are still relevant and unresolved, although I might be corrected by the Secretariat. The scientific committee is very much a creature of the executive committee, and the mandate is spelled out when you take office about what your role is and what you can do or not do. And certainly the sentiments from the questionnaire or the answers that we provided suggested that the mandate and the role of the scientific committee needed to be revisited. We've talked a bit about the decentralization of CODESRIA activities in the sub-regions. We know that this means a lot of money, but it is something worth considering in terms of how CODESRIA implements this Pan-African research agenda. We've also talked about the new kids on the block, the professional associations, the continental bodies, the sub-regional networks of universities. And we know that CODESRIA has developed relations with some of them. We had the Association of African Universities Executive Secretary delivering a solidarity message. But we also need to think more carefully about how we could embed some of our work or collaborate with some of these continental bodies, the African Studies Association of Africa, even ARUA, to really look at how we proceed, given that we often purport to be working on some of the same issues. There is also the whole role of the policy think tanks. What kind of constituencies are we going to build with them? Some of them are very influential, and they do a lot of work, but sometimes they do not have the kind of rigor that characterizes the work that CODESRIA does. How might we connect better with them and influence their work? How might we also connect funding to research that brings together researchers from across the continent to deal with issues that have a continental resonance? I know that CODESRIA is part of the new African Charter for Equitable Research and Collaborations, and it would be useful going forward for it to be elaborated in terms of how more equitable research and collaborations could emerge. CODESRIA, I believe, can play a key role in driving an overarching body of continentally oriented research associations, key institutions, and major funders. For instance, the African Union is forever creating centers for this or that, and sometimes you wonder just how effective they are and whether they are not over-duplicating other bodies. How might CODESRIA engage to get some of these centers relocated within CODESRIA, or in fact, for those funds to be directed to CODESRIA? Finally, we talk about that. We know that our students are very mobile, but we have very few African degree awarding, intra-African degree awarding graduate programs that might promote student mobility on the continent alongside the mobility of faculty. And this would be especially important for students who come to academic maturity with a set of cohorts from Africa, in addition to cohorts from elsewhere, would be well grounded in debates and realities about different parts of the continent. I think that this is something, even though we are talking about funding and sustainability, this is something that going forward, CODESRIA could look meaningfully to and engage. So I'd like to stop here for now and see the floor. Thank you very much.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Je n'ai pas besoin de faire la synthèse puisque vous avez tout dit. On fera peut-être la synthèse à la fin. Et ceci étant, je voudrais passer la parole à M. Ebrima Sall, 6e secrétaire exécutif du CODESRIA. Je vous la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. It is, I think, just fitting to also, follow the tradition. It's more than, and I think it's something we should do, just to congratulate CODESRIA, congratulate all of us, and congratulate the Secretariat and the Executive Committee of CODESRIA and the Scientific Committee. But let me say the secretariats, the executive committees, the scientific committees, and the members, of course, for all the achievements that have been made over the years. I think it's very, important. It's an important milestone. And the interesting thing is that we are celebrating 50 years of CODESRIA in the same month as the centenary of Sheikh Anta Diop is being celebrated. Sheikh Anta Diop on the 30th of December would have, turned 100. And it's also this year that Sembène Ousmane's centenary is being celebrated. Sembène Ousmane, one of the greatest filmmakers anywhere, who was from Senegal. 2 years ago, it was Amadou Mahtar Mbow. So I think this is all very good and happening at the same time. It is implementing a Pan-African scientific agenda. This is an issue I think that a lot of people have already addressed in different ways. And it is good that we've had the president speaking to the governance of CODESRIA and some of the challenges. So they have, I think, set this stage. We've had the discussion on the power dynamics between the Secretariat and the presidents and the Executive Committee. I think it's a legitimate issue, and it's a very important one. Those dynamics have to be watched and managed properly so that you don't have maybe too much power concentrated at one level. But we also have been reminded, one of the previous speakers saying that we are a reflexive organization that has a capacity for self-correction. I think it was Georgie who framed it that way. I think that is one of the things actually that kept CODESRIA going over the years. A committed executive committee, a committed scientific committee, a committed membership that is determined to make sure that we continue to decide on what is important and what we want to work on. And even when there are problems, a few years ago, around the year 2000 or so, with a lot of challenges, the executive committee then, was insistent that whatever reforms that had to be generated, the reforms had to come from within, and it went to the point of actually the EC rejecting an evaluation report that was commissioned by our main funder, because they thought it was a complete misreading of the situation and that they had a way of addressing the challenges then. So I think that is very important that we have this community and that we have strong governance institutions that have been leading us. So the question is why a Pan-African scientific agenda, that's the first question I want to address in the few minutes that I have. And the second question I want to address is, of course, about the future and come back to this perennial problem of funding that has been raised several times, and maybe just say a few things about how at some point we've tried to find a way around the problem. Why a Pan-African scientific agenda? Why was it important in 1973? And why is it still important? And how have we as a community been developing a Pan-African scientific agenda over the years? And, of course, today we can say that the context has changed a lot, and it is still changing. We have, much stronger universities around, but we also have a lot more weaker universities around, the diversity that has been referred to in the earlier presentations. We have more knowledge networks. Some of the ones that have been around are still around, and we have new ones coming up. A number of them have been mentioned, but just two associations that are very close. The African Studies Association of Africa overlaps with CODESRIA in terms of the things that they do. The African Humanities Association, Fred is here. They also sort of are intervening in the same terrain. So it's important to I think, manage those dynamics very well. I think when we discuss these issues, we should also remember that the intellectual history of Africa is much older than CODESRIA itself. It is very, very, very old. And it is much older even than the arrival of the social sciences and humanities as we know them. We have had institutions of knowledge production on the continent, and among the oldest actually in the world, some of which are still around, that are located on the continent, born in this continent, have been operating. That whole history is told in bits and pieces, but somehow at some point maybe having a go at the intellectual history in a much more comprehensive way of the continent, it would be a good thing to do. The UNESCO General History of Africa or the national histories like the Histoire Générale du Senegal, point to some of those important things that have happened at the intellectual level. So we should therefore situate the CODESRIA story in the larger, older, and much more complex story of, I would call it the epistemic self-affirmation of Africa. That's a kind of an attempt to have an understanding of issues from within the continent, which itself is both a precursor, a companion process, to the emancipation processes that are unfolding, and the attempts to reach higher levels of emancipation, higher levels of self-realization of the African people, both within the African continent and outside. It is also, in many ways, the story of CODESRIA and the intellectual history of the continent, a manifestation of what decolonial scholars have called epistemic disobedience. I think it's furthermore about the attempt to reclaim African agency and to reassert it in a number of spaces. In scholarship, of course, as far as we are concerned, and knowledge production, but through research and publications and knowledge production and dissemination, we actually are seeking to enhance, to strengthen African agency more generally. Knowledge contributing to different ways of understanding issues, looking at ourselves from where we are, as has been said, as a way of contributing to the not only understanding issues and dynamics as they are, but also to getting a transformation process going on, and that will be a transformation that will serve the continent in a much better way. So it's about reclaiming African agency in scholarship and knowledge production. It's also about enabling African agency through research. What this means, therefore, is that there is functioning as a community, as a Pan-African community, was almost a normal thing to do, a natural thing to try to do. And CODESRIA tried to do that by transcending all the divides that we know, the disciplinary divides, the language divides, divides along gender lines, regional lines, and so on and so forth, disciplines, of course. And that was seen as a condition for having, scholarship on the African continent, of quality, and also for being able to increase the volume of knowledge produced on the continent. It's also a condition for being relevant, for remaining relevant. And beyond Africa, I think what the founders did in 1973 when they came together, there is a longer history that preceded that one. There was these directors, 12 directors were meeting. They met in Bellagio, they met elsewhere before 1973. But the turning point was 1973, which is why we are referring to that point. What they aspired to do, in the words of Samir Amin, was to imagine and build a Pan-African institution that would be one of the engines that are needed to promote independent and audacious African reflections on the challenges of the contemporary world. So the ambition was never to think about issues that are African only or that are relevant to Africa, but finding solutions and answers to the challenges that the world is facing. So of course the starting point of that whole process was to begin contesting the dominant narratives about Africa, and which meant engaging the colonial library, challenging the colonial library and dominant paradigms of the moment. And that has been done extensively in the history of CODESRIA and in different initiatives that were taken. So what is important is to know that struggle to decolonize the humanities and social sciences, or to engage and transform the colonial library, is actually seen to be part of the bigger struggle that is aiming at transforming the global epistemological order, which itself is mirroring very, very, very well the global order, which is problematic in so many different ways. I think in the first day, we've heard that in some of the presentations, particularly the presentation by Adebayo. I think what we need to say here, I remember what Ato was saying in his comments. Building a community, having a Pan-African intellectual agenda, that is progressive, in some sense is trying to precisely make sense or, give some coherence or find a way of, piecing together, processes that are different, issues that are completely different, and dynamics that are contradictory in some instances. But we know that it wasn't only CODESRIA engaged in that. Clarkso in Latin America was doing something similar as well. Talking about narratives, it is, the point has been made by several people, including a Senegalese philosopher called Manuh, that definitely, we at the minimum, Africans had to be the co-authors of the global narratives. And to be able to be co-authors of the global narratives, they have to be authors of the African narratives, at least be co-authors of the African narratives to begin with. And that got us to create this community of scholars, create a space where we could, create a commons in a sense, or build a commons. Now, the different ways in which CODESRIA tried to do this, to define an agenda, the General Assembly being one moment when that exercise was done routinely, but also later on we had it refined through the development of strategic plans. I think that was started with when Bayo was the executive secretary. And then we had, which were, also processes that involved a lot of people from a cross-section of the community. But that was one way. Defining the agenda was the first thing to do, apart from engaging in the dominant narratives. But of course, the second important issue that CODESRIA had to deal with was just to grow the numbers of people who are into scholarship and scientific production. And that is what I think brought CODESRIA to nurturing generations and generations of young scholars, opening up. The opening up happened in 1992 when the membership was open to individuals. Until then, the first 19 years, it was exclusively institutional. And then from that point in time, you had individuals joining, and it was, I think, a way of bringing a lot of young scholars to be members of the CODESRIA community. In a sense, to be able to, develop a Pan-African scientific agenda and implement it and make sure that it is sustained, it required in having people who are also capable of engaging with the issues, connecting with the history of the continent and the intellectual history of the continent in particular, but also being able to make a reading of phenomena that is emerging, not necessarily by looking at what others are doing or copying from others, but by trying to make sense of it from where we are again. And one good example of that one was the starting of the Governance Institute. That I think one of the people who are alluding it is here. It was started when we had this wave of democratization processes, and the question was whether political science, conventional mainstream political science, was sufficient, to make sense of what we are experiencing on the continent. So the institute was not, born to respond to a crisis. It was born out of a desire to actually keep up with processes and maintain a certain lead in the reading that we are making of this that are unfolding right in front of us. And CODESRIA did a lot to support the young scholars. A lot of things, the institutes, the methodology workshops, writing workshops, textbooks, campuses. A lot of it, was done to make that happen. The third thing that CODESRIA did, which was important for the sustenance of the Pan-African scientific agenda, was of course at the level of publishing and creating publication outlets and publishing outlets. Now, there's no need to belabor this point. We know what publishing in international journals, requires and what is associated with it, the politics of it, the gatekeeping that is involved, the fact that the priorities may be just different. We have had a lot of examples of how what we may think is important, and are debating it. And a good illustration of that is structural adjustment. I think we continue debating structural adjustment on the continent long after it was no longer an issue in other places, simply because it was taking new forms, deepening on the continent. So having publishing outlets for the African community was important, and then journals were set up, and a lot of journals. They were up to 14 at one point. Some run by CODESRIA exclusively, others run along with other institutions in partnership. A fourth important initiative I think we need to mention is the fact that we also wanted to have a control of the instruments of measuring quality, right? And determining what is quality research, what is a quality publication. Not only having peer review, which is a known mechanism everywhere, but also saying that we needed something called an Africa Review of Books. I'm speaking here looking at Manuh, who is one of those who started it. Fred is in the room. Our colleagues in Ethiopia were the other partners as well. But the idea of having that review of books was to say, look, we may have a book that is celebrated elsewhere, but in our context, it actually may not be as good as it may be thought to be, because it is, misleading in some instances of issues, or it may be emphasizing what is very trivial in some other instances. And there are examples of books that have been critiqued extensively from within the continent, and that were celebrated. I don't want to cite any title here to create, some confusion, but there are a lot of examples we can give of those kinds of books. So Africa Review of Books was established as a platform for us to debate scholarship at the continental level, encouraging, of course, reading and, and cross-referencing within the continent, but also giving us the possibility to say, look, from our own perspective, this doesn't make sense, or this is absolutely important to celebrate. Showcasing what is important from our point of view, and of course, taking issues with things that are problematic. We took that further and went to the point of trying to develop an African citation index, to take the whole issue of measurement, because what goes into the mainstream dominant indexes that exist leave out a lot, of material that is produced outside. When it is not English, it has a less chance already of being referenced or taken into account. But also when it comes from certain parts of the world, we also know that it may be problematic. So the African Citation Index was an idea that was, been discussed from 2006 or 7, I think. And then we went further in 2015 when we worked with the Indian Citation Index in a kind of South-South solidarity initiative. Who came actually were helping us to develop it. Unfortunately, we never got the funding to make it happen. It was important to say, look, this is it. We should take the whole, citation and indexing process as well as a way of, strengthening our community and getting instruments that help us determine what is of quality and so on. And there were a lot of other things that were done by CODESRIA. The environment for research, of course, as we mentioned, academic freedom, the Kampala Declaration, and other initiatives. And then, of course, the engagement with policy, became an issue at one point. And it was done in 2 ways, not only having policy dialogues over, issues that are important. It was on conflict, it was on HIV/AIDS, it was on, many of the big issues on the agenda. But it was also a way of engaging our policymakers when they came up with documents like the Lagos Plan of Action or NEPAD, the conference organized, or the African Alternative Framework for Structural Adjustment, which was discussed in CODESRIA Bulletin, for example, the late Achima Feje of blessed memory, and translated into Arabic and published in Cairo. So a lot of things that were done. And I would just want to say one thing that, about this research and these different attempts. I think values were taken very seriously. Values were seen to be very important. There were a whole lot of criteria that were developed that were guiding scholars. The boycott of South Africa under apartheid was something that actually was taken very, very seriously. Any African scholar who went to South Africa under apartheid, was sort of, set aside, marginalized in the community. The second thing is to promote the Pan-African spirit. And I think this is something that people should know. To be a member of a national working group, the determining criteria was not your nationality, or where you were born. What was determining was your residence. And the best illustration of that is a Wamba Jawamba from DRC, Zaire then, who lived in Tanzania almost all his life, represented East Africa in the Executive Committee of CODESRIA, he didn't represent Central Africa where he was from, but he represented East Africa and was elected by the East African scholarly community to represent them in the Executive Committee. And he ended up becoming the president of CODESRIA. I think this is something that is really, really interesting in the sense that people were encouraged to be engaged with the communities where they lived. And a number of other things that were done which encourage cross-referencing, encourage the feeling of being part of the community. And when a national working group was holding even its workshop, you had somebody from a different country sent to be an observer and report back. And the publications from national working groups were systematically translated when they came in French into English and the other way. So all these things contributed to getting CODESRIA to be able to operate in an interesting way, and an attempt to increase the membership, to expand the coverage disciplinary-wise. From the point of view of languages, some of the initiatives I've mentioned, the Lusophone initiative, the Arabophone initiative, and the intergenerational issues as well have been taken up. And of course, publications were sent to universities. I think the point was made in the earlier panel. There was a serious attempt to make sure that all the publications of CODESRIA were sent to the universities of the continent, the university libraries. It was a very expensive process. At one point, an average cost of sending a book to into a library in Nigeria would be a minimum of $10, we say. You send 300 books, every time, 300 copies of every book that is published, and you come up with 30, 40 books. It easily adds up to a lot of money. And when you had funding issues, it became a difficulty. In addition to all the problems with the postages and so on. But what saved the situation was the development of the internet, when we decided to go open access and put all our publications online, and that increased access, in a very, very significant way to as many libraries as we could imagine. I think I will just stop on that particular point in terms of the different ways in which the agenda was implemented on the continent, and move to the second point, which for me is the point about the future and what we definitely need to, think about very seriously. Everything in what we are seeing now is indicating a world that is in such a profound process of transformation that it is difficult to anticipate what will happen beyond a couple of years ahead of us. And one of the most important changes that one will see happen is the fact that by the year 2050, 1 out of every 4 people you meet on this planet will be African, right? 1 out of every 4 people you meet will be African. And among those Africans, 2 out of 3 will be young people. So this is going to be a sea change in terms of the situations and issues that we have to deal with. I am not sure whether our policymakers, our elites, if they are aware of it, and now it's been talked about, very often, but whether the preparation that is required for that particular reality is serious enough. At the level of research, definitely we need to be thinking hard and thinking as hard as we can to make sure that we find, engage with processes that are unfolding now at different levels. There are many initiatives about reimagining work, reimagining the future of work, the future of education. I was part of a group, UNESCO group, that was engaged in producing a report, global report on the future of education, the future of everything, the environment, the future of technology, the future of, everything is changing. So I think we need to get CODESRIA to pivot a little bit in that, and take that debate in the coming years, in a very serious way. The challenge, of course, will be how you fund that, how you fund research, including on areas and issues that are not seen to be priority issues by some of our partners. I think we appreciate the generosity of those who have been supporting African institutions and African research when African governments were not doing that. They may have their own reasons for doing it, but for some of them it was out of declared intention to be in solidarity with Africa. I mean, the Nordics in particular, had that explanation of why they were supporting independent thinking in Africa through CODESRIA. But a lot has changed at that level as well. The considerations are no longer the same. There are other kinds of considerations everywhere. So what do we do? How do we support a progressive Pan-African research agenda? The liberal research initiatives, Pan-African will not get funded. They get funded. Even now, there are institutions of research on the continent that are into mainstream economic research. They get funded, a lot of it. We are talking about transformative research, progressive research that has to be at the Pan-African level to support what we think is important for us on our continent. Being imaginative and creative about the way we fund that research, I think is one of the greatest challenges that we are faced with today. I think, this is documented also. I mean, a study by Alex Eze on the funding of research institutions in 2018 revealed that actually very, 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 very few research institutions of Africa have annual budgets of up to $10 million. Somehow there's a kind of ceiling that we never break. We never break into. And there is the issues of trust. The issues of, that's why Trust Africa is called Trust Africa. There are a lot of issues involved here, and there have been ideas as to how you go about doing it. One being to create a fund where you get some of the funding agencies of the North or private foundations putting money and then challenging African governments to match those funds, and other mechanisms have been considered. It's not only research that is underfunded that has challenges with funding. It's also true of civil society generally. It is true of philanthropy even, African philanthropy. Trust Africa is, together with Urgent Action Fund for Africa, we launched an initiative last year that we're calling Reimagining Pan-African and Feminist Philanthropies. One of the ambitions being to unlock resources for philanthropy. Basically, you have exactly the same issues of, asymmetries of power, or problematic relationships with those who are supporting these philanthropies, particularly when they are from the North. So it's a problem that I think Africa has to address. Some interesting ideas being expressed along those lines is to see how to create mechanisms, funds, endowments, among others, serious ones, and big ones, not aiming for 20 million, 30 million, or 100 million, $1 billion endowments, and coming together as Pan-African institutions and then raising money to get them there. And using public resources in some instances to do that. there are a minimum of 50 European foundations that are funded with it, if not more. This is a study by Johns Hopkins University, that were established with public funding. The best example being Volkswagen Foundation. Volkswagen Foundation was established by the German government that was kind of punishing it for the misbehavior that they had during the Nazi era. And it's one of the biggest funders of research in Germany. So there is no reason why public money cannot be used to support research on this continent. And we can have mechanisms. I don't think it's also a good idea to have African governments being members of CODESRIA. But one thing we tried was to contact all African governments and invite them to look at what CODESRIA is doing and make one-off contributions to a fund that will be managed with an independent board to support research. And we had the support of Kofi Annan in that process, who and the Carnegie Corporation established, facilitated some contacts for us. And we wrote to all of them. Some responded, others never did. But the point was, they should take this idea of African research independently developed that serves the African agenda, even if it's in a way that challenges what the policymakers are doing at some point. But it serves the African agenda, and it is better to have that research and get the African governments to put in, within what their limits, one of contributions, and then those contributions will be helped to use research. Another idea that has been discussed in this other initiative that we are talking about, Pan-African and feminist and Pan-African philanthropies, is to use some of the assets that we hope will be recovering from the illicit financial flows. Illicit financial flows are making the continent lose close to $100 billion a year. The Thabo Mbeki report, Thabo Mbeki led a high-level panel set up by the African Union and the UNECA, and they produced a report in 2015 that said, at that time, $50 billion have been lost to the continent every year. The estimates now of the UNECA, UNCTAD and others, is that it's between 88 and $90 billion a year, or some are saying even 100 billion. Now, several things are related to this. That hemorrhage has to stop, because these are resources that are lost to the continent that could have gone to support research, education, health, development, and so on. So stopping the bleeding, the hemorrhage, is the first thing to do. At the same time, recovering the assets that are kept in fiscal tax havens in different parts of the world and in banks in other parts of the world also should be recovered. And that is now something that people are thinking about. And there's an African common position on asset recovery, which is developed as a framework for guiding the work on those issues. But once you recover the assets, what do you do with them? And there's a foundation in Mozambique that is funded in part with money recovered from the Mozambican debt. Mozambique owed money to Portugal. At one point, this is in development, discussions about the debt and how to deal with the African debt and the debt of the South more generally. How do you get debt repayment to be done on funds that support public causes? And one foundation was developed with that kind of money. So I'm saying here is that I think people can be imaginative as to how to generate resources, diversify funding sources, get as much funding as you can, that's fine. Money from African philanthropy also, when it is possible, but also be creative about ways in which we can get public resources to be used to support research. And if I can say this, and this is my last point, the NRF supports research in South Africa. I don't know of any South African scholar who says, I will go to get money from the NRF. Right? But you know that there's a mechanism that has been developed so that NRF will not control you in what you are doing if they give you money. So we can do that. If you can't do that at the level of a country, let's think about ways of doing it at the level of the continent or at the level of a sub-region, and then that should be the thing. So this is what I thought I could share with you on this issue of developing and implementing the Pan-African scientific agenda. CODESRIA was not born to respond to crisis. It took the response to crisis, as a must, because the community it is dealing with was going through the crisis, and we had to find a way of responding, training young scholars, doing all the things that have been done. The situation has improved, and one of the things that kept CODESRIA going is the ability to figure out how to intervene in the right ways and at the right moment and do the things that add value and support the institutions of the continent. I think the university should come back to the CODESRIA community in a much more important way. They were there at the beginning, the first 19 years. They kind of withdrew when the individuals came in, at least at the governance level. I think we need to get the universities back in, and we can have a mechanism and a CODESRIA that can continue to lead the way in terms of the thinking and the transformation processes that we have to push forward on this continent. So we have a future to create, and CODESRIA is often cited as a successful, as a good example of a working Pan-African mechanism. I think with a few exceptions, things have worked pretty well between scholars of different parts of the continent, between different languages and so on. And I think we should find a way of, taking that forward, and particularly at the level of the scientific agenda of the council. Congratulations again to the Secretariat, and thank you, Godwin, and all the colleagues of the Secretariat for making this happen. We know what it takes. So we look at you almost feeling sorry for you, because you don't sleep and you have all the tension and things to deal with. The difficulty with CODESRIA General Assemblies is not only the physical thing, work and writing papers, it's also all the things that you manage, to make sure that things go well. So congratulations and thank you all and for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Ebrima, merci. Nous voulons gagner du temps. Je sais que si on regarde les interventions passées, il y a beaucoup plus une mise en perspective de l'agenda qui a été déjà élaboré en 1993 avec une restitution dans le cadre de ce qui a été fait. Je souhaite peut-être maintenant que Bayo va prendre la parole, qu'il nous donne encore le cap davantage, parce que nous sommes un peu dans la mouvance de la transformation structurelle de l'Afrique. Peut-être que dans ce cadre-là, le CODESRIA a certainement beaucoup de choses à faire dans ce processus, puisque nous sommes en train de nous projeter vers l'avenir, vers les 50 ans à venir. Monsieur le professeur Bayo.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the panelists also for the perspectives which have been shared. Actually, from this morning, as I listened to Peter Yang-Yongo, I kept saying to myself that maybe the time is overdue, that many of us, several of us present in this room, should be challenged to put down our story of CODESRIA in writing in order to at least have it documented for posterity. And that conviction was even reinforced further for me when our former presidents shared some of their reflections before we went for lunch. Now I'd like to take as my starting point a confession, which I'm sure Ebrima, Godwin, and others will recognize, Zen, that the worst nightmare of any executive secretary is the thought that you might be the last executive secretary of CODESRIA. And it speaks to the precarity of an institutional nature which you have to manage on an ongoing basis without letting the rest of the world know about that precarity. You live the precarity, you suffer it with sleeplessness, but you project something that is sure-footed and assured to the rest of the world in a certain way as to keep your community mobilized. And I can give many examples of that situation. But the more important thing is the lesson which we draw out of it. It seems to me that in order to build a sustainable Pan-African intellectual agenda, our starting point may not even necessarily be the kinds of thematic issues that we might want to focus upon as much as the institutional foundation that we want to establish. And for me, this in the hierarchy of challenges that CODESRIA is confronted with. If I'm to list, as our presidents did, a series of challenges that's an unfinished business, I would say that for me, in the hierarchy of challenges, it is to stabilize CODESRIA to a point where we can stop or put an end to the stop, go, stop story that has characterized our council. And I'm sure there are people here who will relate with this point. The early days were tough days. Tandika used to say to us that CODESRIA is a labor of love. It's not a place where you go to build a career. It's not a place where you go to make money. If you want money, you can earn money elsewhere. But if you take on the vocation, either in the secretariat or in the executive committee or scientific committee, it's a statement of a labor of love. And it's a very significant observation. Now, those early difficult years were surmounted by the time my generation, the so-called second generation, straddling the third generation, entered into CODESRIA, right? 1992 probably was our watershed year. Mahmoud Mamdani, Jimmy Adeshina, Zen, people who are present in Novotel, hotel here in Dakar at the General Assembly, where there was both a twin process of rebellion and renewal. A twin process of rebellion and renewal, Marimaturi. It was an assembly that was, of course, organized around a scientific theme, but which in the end actually became a discussion about the soul of the institution and where it would be headed in the future. And I'll just perhaps add a small corrective to say that institutional membership may have been robust at a point in time. By the General Assembly of 1992, it was also clear that institutional membership was in trouble because institutional attendees at the General Assembly were very few. And at least from where I came, where Jimmy Adeshina came, we were locked in battles with those who purported to be the institutional representatives of Nigeria in CODESRIA, who were locked into relationships with the military and with whom we were having intellectual contestations of various kinds. And it seemed completely unacceptable that we would sit down and allow those same people to be the ones to determine the future of our Pan-African institution. That was the trigger for the rebellion that took place in the General Assembly of that year to bring in individual membership and to exercise the individual right to vote for the executive committee at that General Assembly, plus other resolutions which were passed of, I would argue, a relatively transformative nature. And many will agree that in many senses, the Budra Nkandawire years in CODESRIA were certainly amongst the most robust that we have had on record in terms of not only the growth of the resources of the institution, but also its intellectual agenda and impact. And it was not so much because the publications were fanciful with the best design in the world, as much as that they became the reference point for helping particularly a younger generation of African scholars to frame their thinking about things that were going on, of developments around us for which we were looking for meaning and to seek understanding. And what CODESRIA offered was that framework to be able to ask the hard questions and begin to think autonomously. Post-Nkandawire, we had a period of decline. We tried through the Zen years, Mandani years, and subsequently to build back. And then we had another trough connected to a series of interconnected processes which we are living with today. And I want to submit to this assembly that if there is any lesson that we can learn from the stop-go-stop approach, it is that, at least insofar as our funders are concerned, with all of the goodwill that can come from them, it will be the biggest mistake of our community to assume that the culture of solidarity that we once knew and enjoyed in the 70s will continue into the future. It's already over in some instances. It is so comprehensively over that when Fatima was talking about managerialism, I chuckled and I said, you actually haven't seen managerialism yet. Managerialism in which your funder actually becomes a managerial institution itself. And you spend the bulk of your time, 90% of your time, responding to managerial questions as executive secretary, rather than implementing the intellectual agenda that has been defined by a General Assembly. And you know, the fancies of the managerial approach change from season to season. We started with all kinds of matrices. Ebrima, you remember, when CEDA came to us and said that they now had a new framework for reporting. We looked at it and we said, no, this doesn't work for us. If you guys want to count how many lives we transformed on the continent on the basis of your matrices, go ahead and do so. But we don't function in that way. But this was also at a time when it was still possible to debate with some of our funders, because subsequently, managerialism became also more high-handed and authoritarian. It was no longer a question of it works for us or it doesn't work for us. It became a question of you have to do it this way. Now, as an executive secretary, you're thinking, okay, I've signed contracts for research networks. I have staff members whose salary will have to be paid by the end of the month. And then I have my conviction that this framework simply doesn't work. And you are being told that a dime will not be released to you until you conform with that framework. I think this is just an illustration of some of the kinds of challenges which I feel that as a community, 50 years on, we have to confront head on. And colleagues, for me, it's a matter of dignity. It's a matter of dignity. There is no worse in dignity. And again, to paraphrase Tandika, he was our teacher. He oriented practically every executive secretary who came after him, took time to give us orientation sessions. He said to me once that, you know, you can't imagine how humiliating it is to fly to some donor and in 2 or 3 sentences, your proposal and what you thought you had agreed on is simply thrown away, and you are told this is no longer our priority. But you absorb some of that humiliation for a greater cause and for a greater good. It's a matter of dignity. And if we, as a community, consider ourselves to be a community of dignified people, believe you me, we will begin to solve our funding challenges in the institution. And these challenges have come to a head yet again. I had a visit with some colleagues to Abdallah Bujra, second executive secretary of CODESRIA. He's over 80, frail, but still lucid. And we had an extended discussion. And I have his memoirs of his time and years in CODESRIA. I recalled some of the content of that memoir with him. Now, at the end of the day, it also came down to the same thing. How many of us have heard Fatima and other colleagues, let's our universities contribute to the work of CODESRIA, institutional memberships? I am convinced that unless it is considered by our institutional members, by the universities, by individual members, that this is our duty and CODESRIA is our institution, it's not going to happen. There are universities, and I dare say a good majority of universities on this continent which will not touch CODESRIA. For CODESRIA even to host an activity on their campus is a lot of negotiation, simply because CODESRIA might be seen by their governments as being radical. Right? You are too independent, and being too independent means too radical. Now, how many of them will, in that context, agree to put resources from their universities to say, we like what CODESRIA does, we are contributing a certain amount? My hope, therefore, in all of this actually resides with our individual members, much more than our institutional members. To start the process, not because we will raise enough money to stabilize the institution. And in stabilizing the institution, I believe also addressing some of the issues about the balances between the executive committee and the executive secretariat. If an executive secretary comes into CODESRIA in a context of crisis and difficulty, I don't know how many regulatory oversight activities can be undertaken that will effectively make it possible for you to have that balance in the relationship. It is stability that begets the balance which we seek and which is desirable for us to work towards. In a context in which we are working in a crisis mode, and Zen alluded to it, in which your everyday preoccupation is how to secure the next year, and after that, the following year, almost on the basis of living from hand to mouth, or in which, as an executive secretary, 90% of your time is spent writing reports for donors, so that the more successful you are at fundraising, the more reports you have to write to your funders. Success begets more pain in this particular context. No substitute, in my view, than to go back and look at ourselves and say, what can we do? And I'll give an analogy. The African Union Secretariat building in Addis Ababa is a giant structure. When it was going to be put up, a debate was held with the commission. And the chair of the commission at the time very proudly announced that our friends from China have decided that they will build it and donate it to us as a gift. It was an option. But a Pan-African institution built and donated to us by China. And within 6 months of the inauguration of the building, the same chairperson of the commission was complaining that all our discussions are being listened to in Beijing. I said, well, I don't know what you expected, actually. I don't know what you expected. Because the other option was to say that let every African citizen who is willing donate in their national currencies for the construction of the AU building. And on the basis of the donations, we would get the central banks to convert it into whatever currency is needed in order to put up that structure. $200 million, 1 billion Africans. Some will contribute $1 equivalent, 50 cents equivalent. Others might give $100, but we would have raised more than 200 million. But obviously this was not supposed to be an African Union of the people at the end of the day. And this is precisely what I think we need to draw lessons from in order to address our own challenges. Each of us, individually, as our former president said, must look at ourselves and ask, what do I bring to this CODESRIA? If I owe my entire intellectual development, my own whatever I am today, in Africa, in the diaspora, to CODESRIA, it is not enough to graduate from CODESRIA and then feel too big for CODESRIA. As if it doesn't matter anymore. It has served its purposes for me. I've moved on. And I relate to CODESRIA as I relate to any other thing. I'm not preaching a religious message, but I say it's a matter of dignity at the end of the day. And it is our individual and collective dignity that is at stake to ensure that we can stabilize the council for the long durée in order to enable us to put an end to the stop-go-stop cycle that the council has experienced. And that can enable it, therefore, to work on the basis of accumulation of its agenda, in which it builds on previous rounds of success, not to do the same thing repeatedly, but to move to new and higher grounds. And new and higher grounds are what we need more than ever before on the continent. And it is true that we have many universities that do all kinds of things on our continent. But as was mentioned earlier on, there are also many other things that require to be done in order to ensure that African scholarship and research gets the kind of standing and voice which it must have. We cannot be content that in all of the analytic reports published about scholarship on Africa, we still remain a minority, actually. If you look at the weighting, you are told 60% of all output on Africa comes from the United States, the African Studies community in the United States. However inaccurate those figures may be, it's still, in my view, the case that, well, Georgie, you are wondering if we are really an epistemic community, that we have not really been successful completely in being the masters of the narrative on a consistent basis. We won the argument on structural adjustment, but we also lost the narrative on several other things. And again, I argue that it's on account of the fact that we are locked in a stop-go-stop approach experience in institution building that effectively seems to mean that from cycle to cycle, we jump on the same spot. Sometimes jumping higher. I think if I qualify my own time in the Secretariat, I would say that it was partly an exercise in trying to jump even higher than before, but not necessarily breaking enough new frontiers of a forward-looking and futuristic nature. So ideas which had been proposed before, a former chair of the scientific committee, Suleiman Bashir Diagne, talked about a bibliothèque africaine, an African repository of knowledge for which CODESRIA could easily be an important node, in which we would effectively become an authoritative center for knowledge which will be classified elsewhere as gray literature, but which in fact is central to our interpretation and understanding of our world. Of the possibilities of leveraging technology much more than we have done so far. And I have to salute the efforts which Godwin and colleagues have made in the last few years with the digital bulletin or online bulletin and others where those are delivered to our inboxes on a regular basis. But we can do more, I believe. And some of the activities that we used to organize physically can more easily be disseminated through various multimedia channels that effectively become a must go to and must use by at least a younger generation that is inquisitive enough to want to engage with such critical thinking. Of the necessity for us to use advanced fellowships on an increased scale and in a strategic manner to help shape the direction of research, to set the agenda for research. We tried to revive it. I don't remember how many, maybe you remember, Ebrima, we started with 10 advanced research fellowships with the ambition that we might scale this up to something like 50 on a budget of about $10,000 and above. But this was a drop in the ocean at the end of the day for a continent of this dimension. And it was really, at the end, an exercise in symbolism more than a substantive dent of the kind which would have been desirable for us to make. But this is where, again, I see the possibilities of us also taking our journals much more seriously. And I believe that the journals, perhaps even more than the books, represents a key instrument that can help us to shape the agenda, to shape the narrative, to consolidate an epistemic community of the kind which we have aspired for. The citations index, which Ebrima referred to, was supposed, if it worked, to be a flagship program of the council at some point in time. It did not take off as we expected. We tried. And I believe, again, if the stop-go-stop situation that we are confronted with is properly addressed, we may actually be able to devote quality resources alongside the review of books, properly managed, properly resourced, and playing the kind of role that was envisaged for it. But the idea of the citation index was simply to say that this would be a direct challenge to the hierarchies of power in the academy. Who decides who is the best or leading scholar on social policy in Africa? Somebody will sit in Princeton and write a review and say that somebody they are financing with some neoliberal agenda is your leading scholar. We'll say, well, maybe we should take the fight to them. Let's take the fight to them. You produce so much about Africa. We will spend part of our time through indexation to rank them, and to rank them according to criteria that we decide and define. And vice versa, also promote those from our community who produce cutting-edge work that deserves much greater attention than is often given by the dominant journals. Here again, I see the possibilities that present themselves for the future. Insofar as research funding, direct research funding and networks are concerned, it seems to me coined something which I called launch, operate, and transfer. And the idea that CODESRIA does not need to hold on to any instrument of research support or publication ad infinitum. In the process of self-renewal and self-correction, it is important from the outset to have in mind that whatever we do today is a potential candidate to be transferred to other institutions tomorrow. And that speaks to the kinds of partnerships which we build. The idea, as Zen will recall with regard to the Africa Review of Books, for example, and Nuria will also recall, was not to keep it in the CODESRIA Secretariat. To offer critical support through an incubation period. I think we defined a period of 5 years of incubation and then let it go. Still under the broad CODESRIA label, but not necessarily produced entirely within the Secretariat. And it's the same thing for many of the research instruments, the institutes, and the like, which came into existence and simply disappeared because we had no framework within which, on the basis of partnerships established, we'll be able to transfer these to institutional partners that would run them as CODESRIA programs without the Secretariat being responsible for the nitty-gritty work of organizing those. So launch, operate, and transfer within a clearly defined time frame. In the end, this will fit into the mandate of the Council to serve as an institutional basis for the production of knowledge on the continent. Sometimes we forget that aspect of the CODESRIA mandate, to support the institutional basis of knowledge production on the continent, which means basically also reaching out to other networks and supporting them in the knowledge. And I would say probably that in the settled knowledge, that at least as far as I've experienced it myself, CODESRIA is at its best when its national and local scholarly communities are robust enough. When national academic scholarly communities are reasonably robust and functioning, that energy is refracted into the work which the Council does. And the challenge is to ensure that in periods of crisis at the national or local level, where epistemic communities may be disrupted for a variety of reasons, that CODESRIA is able to ride the wave, ride the tide in a way that also contributes to the revival or the renewal of such communities, while simultaneously maintaining its own mandate. So, I mean, on the funding component, I think you can see that for me, it seems to me to be the next frontier challenge for the Council. A lot depends on it, to the extent to which we continue to depend on external sources of support, and there are many who have goodwill towards the Council still, but we should also recognize that there are old institutional partners, some of them who were there from 1973, who have changed direction completely, 360 degrees change in direction, and who even do not see any benefit in supporting research on the African continent. As one of the old established funders once said to me, maybe it's better to spend money digging a borehole in Ethiopia to give people clean water than to give the same money to CODESRIA to support a working group in Ethiopia. What difference that would make in the lives of people, and we can measure that. But when we give you and you say you created a national working group in Ethiopia, you produce a book, but you cannot tell me who reads the book. You cannot tell me what use your recommendations were put to, and so on and so forth. It's a sea change, which is not simply a question of fashion that is shifting, but is actually a political shift that is occurring. A political shift to the right in most countries, which also simultaneously is reflective of the season of uncertainty in the international system, in which for a majority of the voters in some of these countries, fear of the future is also an important element in the decisions which they make on who to give power to, decisions which also refract themselves into notions of international cooperation and solidarity. So, as I said on the first day, nobody owes us a living. If funding were to stop to CODESRIA from our funders from Europe and the US and elsewhere tomorrow, the question we must ask ourselves is whether there will still be a CODESRIA and how many of us are prepared to step forward in order to do the necessary work of ensuring that the institution continues to function. And in that way also, finally, we are able to adopt, if we were to secure and guarantee our funding as a matter of individual and collective dignity. In that way, it seems to me we are also able to move into scholarship that is less reactive and more of a proactive engagement with our questions, with our circumstances, without necessarily feeling that we owe intellectual accountability to anybody. Thank you very much.
Merci, Bayo, pour cette contribution. Bon, de manière générale, on voit que la mise en œuvre du programme scientifique panafricain fait face à un certain nombre de contraintes. Bien évidemment, il y a la matière à réfléchir, il y a des réflexions à mettre en œuvre, mais comme l'ont dit les intervenants, il y a la nécessité d'une stabilisation, il y a la nécessité de trouver les axes de financement, il y a la nécessité d'une réflexion bien approfondie pour pouvoir se projeter à l'avenir par rapport aux défis qui nous attendent. Alors, je vais ouvrir l'espace pour pouvoir donner la parole à ceux qui voudraient réagir à la suite des interventions du panel. Sur ce sujet qui est un sujet fondamentalement structurant. On n'est qu'au début de l'après-midi et on dirait, oui, Sheila. Là.
Thank you. Thank you. First, a big congrats to all the panelists, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and your perspectives. And also, I would like to respond a little bit to what Bayo has said, because I'm personally touched. I'm personally touched and moved for the simple reason that you prick our conscience, Bayo, by asking us what we can do as individual academic scholars on the continent. And I think that is an extremely important point that we tend to hesitate to speak about. And yet, at this particular juncture, more than ever before, it is perhaps, to my mind, the most important question as to what we can do. Now, this question is actually linked to the very point that you make about dignity on the continent. And I would go to the extent of saying that unless we really rethink ourselves and ask these pertinent questions as to what we can do, this whole business of decolonizing our minds, which we've been at for years trying to do, will still be very much up in the air, and we will find ourselves still struggling to decolonize the mind. The reason I say this is because I come from a very little island. My experience of CODESRIA is very different from many people. I didn't come to CODESRIA as a young scholar. I came to CODESRIA as part of the staff of CODESRIA for a couple of years and worked with Bayo, Ebrima, and some other colleagues and the staff of the Secretariat. And as a woman islander who struggles on the continent, because we are at an era where we're talking about the Pan-African vision for the future of the social sciences. As an islander living on the margins in many ways, with very small universities, with very little possibilities, and yet we are opening our doors to all forms of internationalization, this element of internationalization of higher education, not only because I'm talking at a personal level, but more particularly because this is happening in a big way on the continent, and that articulation that we need to think about, where does CODESRIA stand at this particular point with the kind of internationalization and the implanting of offshore campuses in our spaces, in our universities. Well, then it seems to me, from just talking to people and young people on the continent, not only in my country, there is a kind of a shift in the thinking where the young people, and I'm not generalizing, but many of the young people will go in particular kinds of fields that this internationalization calls for, where the question of where we are and where do we stand as a continent is not something that they would be particularly concerned with. And yet we are at a time where our institutions are under threat, our lives are under threat, because I think the one thing that we haven't talked enough about at this particular conference, and yet it is very much linked to the pandemic, which is the theme of the
conference is this whole question of climate change. We have evoked it. I'm not saying that we haven't talked about it at all. We have evoked it, but I see it as, something that we really need to think through a little bit more and perhaps develop a program, a Pan-African program linked to the whole business of how climate change itself can be such a threat and impact on our knowledge production systems. And that is, to me, something very important. But just to round it up and to conclude, I would want to say a big thank you again, but also come back to this question of dignity a little bit, because I think in a few days' time, I was saying that earlier to some colleagues, in a few days' time, the whole world will be once more celebrating the International Human Rights Day. And the theme for 2023 is actually dignity, freedom, and justice. And these three words, dignity, freedom, and justice, should be the markers of what should be governing our way ahead. Because unless we do that and try to entrench it into our minds, into our thinking, into the development of our new programs, I don't think we would run very far. And yet we do need to run very far and very fast. Thank you. And congrats to CODESRIA and happy anniversary on the 50th anniversary of CODESRIA.
Merci beaucoup, Sheila. Oui, madame.
Thank you very much, and may I take this opportunity also, because I'm the second person to speak, to appreciate for sharing the stories of the CODESRIA with us as we celebrating the 50 years. There was an issue on the universities supporting CODESRIA, and what came into my mind is, what is the situation in our universities, majority of them in Africa at the moment? As far as I know, many of the staffs at the universities are organizing, and they have failed to organize. And our universities, majorities are in shambles. So if we want to get support from our universities as CODESRIA, I think now we need to rescue some of our universities, because the staff at the universities, their lives are very complicated. They are very difficult. They are not part of the government support if they are government universities. We see more politicians being paid more than our scholars at the universities. So if we want our universities even to contribute to CODESRIA, I think we need to rethink the scenario in the coming 50 years in our universities. How will they be? And the issue of 50 years, my question is, where are we positioning ourselves as CODESRIA? Is it that we are positioning ourselves in relation to the past 50 years, or we are positioning ourselves in the coming 50 years? Thank you.
Merci. Nouria.
Merci, et merci vraiment à tous les intervenants qui, chacun à sa manière, nous a restitué l'histoire du CODESRIA, avec ses hauts, ses bas, avec ses points forts et ses points faibles. Et merci également d'avoir rappelé que le CODESRIA, fondamentalement, continue à s'inscrire contre le narratif dominant sur l'Afrique et contribue et encourage à produire un savoir autonome. Mais ce qui me semble fondamental aujourd'hui, et je crois que ça a très bien été dit par les secrétaires exécutifs, c'est qu'il faut préserver le CODESRIA. Le préserver pour le renforcer et ensuite l'élargir. Mais pour le préserver, évidemment, le nerf de la guerre, ce sont les finances. Alors, à mon sens, je ne sais pas dans quelle mesure les démarches envers l'Union africaine et les États africains ont été menées et ont abouti négativement ou positivement? Est-ce qu'on a été suffisamment engagé dans ce processus ou pas? Parce qu'il me semble, à mon sens, qu'il faut contourner peut-être aussi la vision manichéenne qui nous amène à choisir entre deux pôles, entre l'individuel et l'institutionnel, entre l'institutionnel ou le personnel. Il me semble que, et Bayo a raconté pourquoi il y a eu un conflit et pourquoi il était important, à un moment donné, de donner une parole majoritaire à l'individuel. Mais sur le continent africain, toutes les institutions de l'enseignement supérieur et de la recherche ne sont pas dans le même état, même si on reconnaît que la médiocrité est en train de gagner, et de gagner très fort, le terrain en Afrique. Alors, il me semble qu'il faille faire ce travail d'identification d'institutions qui méritent, par la production, par le travail qui est fourni, qui méritent d'être les partenaires institutionnels du CODESRIA. Et sur ce terrain, nous avons eu une expérience, je peux le dire modestement, fabuleuse avec le CODESRIA, avec non seulement les ateliers méthodologiques, mais également avec la Revue africaine des livres et aussi avec les séminaires que nous avons organisés, notamment sur les libertés académiques. Ça a permis de rapprocher, franchement, particulièrement en Afrique du Nord, et je parle plus particulièrement de l'Algérie, où finalement le regard porté sur le Nord était plus important que justement l'ancrage dans le continent africain. Le travail qui a été mené avec le CODESRIA a aidé tous nos nouveaux chercheurs, d'abord à venir visiter, à se déplacer, à faire les instituts. Et là, honnêtement, sans cette institution, cette maison qui nous a permis de nous regrouper, je ne pense pas, malgré les moyens dont nous disposions, je ne pense pas qu'on serait arrivé à cela. Alors, préserver, peut-être qu'il faut continuer à démarcher, ne pas baisser les bras. Et merci de dire que l'engagement est un élément important et que si le CODESRIA offre une possibilité justement d'échange et de partage, le CODESRIA suppose aussi qu'on a une dette envers lui parce qu'il nous permet d'être aujourd'hui ensemble. C'est celui de le lui rendre en non seulement poussant cet ancrage national du CODESRIA de diverses manières et aussi peut-être la formule des groupes nationaux de travail et des groupes multinationaux de travail. Là aussi, c'était un dispositif vraiment qui a permis de réfléchir, y compris sur le terrain local, et d'échanger avec des collègues. Donc encore une fois, franchement, personnellement, je remercie beaucoup tous les efforts et tous les collègues qui sont passés et le travail fourni pour maintenir le CODESRIA là où il est. Merci.
Pas d'autres? Ah oui, au fond, s'il vous plaît.
I join everybody in thanking the panelists. I'd like to take the opportunity to draw attention to something that I know is happening back home in Ghana. I'm not sure what is happening in other countries. And it's in the field of the products of the educational systems that we are worried about. The embassies of some of the major Western countries are openly advertising for the recruitment of our young people, but only the skilled ones. A few weeks ago, the information came into the open that this year alone, so far, the UK has successfully recruited and issued visas to 10,000 teachers, Ghanaian teachers, trained at the expense of the state. we know that what is happening in the medical area with our nurses, midwives, and medical doctors is perhaps registering the recruitment of higher numbers. I just want to bring this up. I don't know whether it is happening in other African countries. I'm sure it may be. So every day, every morning, you walk past the American embassy, the Canadian embassy, the British High Commission. There are long queues of our young people waiting to be interviewed for visas, working visas. And we don't seem, at least at the level, official level of the state, they don't seem to be bothered. So if we sit here worrying about, laying out reasonably good educational programs for our young people, only for some people to recruit them as soon as they graduate, what is the point? Is there anything we can do about it? That's my question and a suggestion. Thank you.
Merci. Question très importante. Marima, notre grande mascotte nationale, internationale.
Merci beaucoup, Georges. Je voulais... Enfin, j'étais venue surtout pour écouter, mais je pense que ce que Kofi vient de dire et ce que la jeune vient de dire sur l'état de nos universités, je pense que ça doit nous engager à réfléchir nos relations avec nos universités, d'abord en partant du fait qu'ils sont dans une diversité. C'est quelqu'un qui disait ici au CODESRIA que la communauté des chercheurs n'est pas une communauté d'unanimistes, mais ça c'est aussi la vérité, que la communauté des chercheurs, la communauté des universités africaines n'est pas une communauté monolithique. Et leur situation n'est pas non plus une situation homogène. Et je pense que de ce point de vue, il y a deux paramètres qui me semblent importants à tenir dans cette discussion. Nos rapports avec nos universités ne doivent pas être vus seulement au niveau de la tête pensante des universités, au niveau des dirigeants des universités et au niveau de ceux qui incarnent l'institution du plan institutionnel. Mais c'est dans une globalité, surtout avec les jeunes universitaires. Et je pense que notre responsabilité, c'est aussi de regarder comment nous pouvons, en rapport avec les jeunes, créer un certain patriotisme, avoir une certaine orientation de ce qu'ils doivent et ce qu'ils peuvent faire en Afrique et pour l'Afrique. Et ce que Kofi dit, quelqu'un a dit là-bas tout à l'heure que le CODESRIA était né pour répondre à une crise. Aujourd'hui aussi, le CODESRIA fait face à d'autres types de crises. C'est peut-être que la question du financement, elle est la plus nodale, qu'elle nous révèle réellement ce que nous sommes dans cette affaire. Je ne dis pas quand les gens te disent simplement que nous ne sommes plus... Ah oui, vous voulez venir chercher de l'argent, ce n'est plus dans notre agenda. Mais quand les gens écrivent et se comportent explicitement en disant « ne venez surtout pas parce que nous, vous n'êtes pas notre priorité ». Notre agenda de coopération, il est tourné vers l'Ukraine aujourd'hui. Nous sommes la France, nous sommes l'Angleterre, nous sommes la Suède. Nous sommes une communauté, excusez-moi de le dire comme ça, raciale, européenne, occidentale. Nous avons des personnes de notre communauté qui sont confrontées à des problèmes. Vous n'êtes plus notre agenda. Et je pense que cette désobéissance épistémique, c'est dans l'esprit des enfants qu'il faut la faire germer. La dernière chose que je veux dire aussi, c'est que c'est vrai que nous ne sommes pas beaucoup, nous ne sommes pas nombreux. Mais c'est même difficile de faire payer une cotisation de $50 par année à quelqu'un ou à quelqu'une dans notre communauté. Et si tu ne viens pas participer à une activité où on te prend en charge, hier on se disait avec Rokhaya, où sont les Sénégalais dans l'Assemblée générale? Mais je pense que c'est aussi symptomatique des relations que nous avons avec nos communautés universitaires. Parce que la communauté universitaire qui est la plus immédiate ici, c'est la population des 5 universités ou des 7 universités du Sénégal, si je ne parle simplement que des universités publiques. Je pense que ce débat est complexe, passionnant, mais ce débat nous révèle aussi beaucoup de choses sur nous-mêmes. Comment beaucoup de nous pouvons nous dire, beaucoup de nous, même si ce n'est pas significatif, nous donnons une journée de travail ou l'équivalent d'une journée de travail pour le financement ou pour le fonds de dotation. Quelqu'un avait rigolé, c'est Moupaté, paix à son âme, pour dire qu'on n'a qu'à vendre les bracelets en or de Marema. Mais je pense que c'est des choses qu'il faut regarder sérieusement. Il faut regarder sérieusement, concrètement, à notre échelle, qu'est-ce que nous pouvons faire? Parce que sinon, je pense que dans 50 ans aussi, malheureusement, la génération à qui nous allons léguer le CODESRIA sera dans le même esprit d'attendre qu'est-ce que les autres peuvent faire pour que nous puissions continuer à survivre. Pardon.
Une intervention de plus, large contribution. Bon, oui.
So thank you very much to the other panelists and also to all of you from the floor. I think that Bayo's contribution in particular brought us a real dose of reality and the future that we face. I used to live in Addis Ababa. I used to work there. And I'm very skeptical of the African Union as a source of funding for us, given that the African Union is very dependent on the European Union for most of its programs. I think we have a diversity of institutions. Some of them are strong, some of them are okay, some of them are weak. But there are also power relations within our institutions. I do remember when CODESRIA was based on institutional memberships, where deans took it almost as their personal property and promoted who they wanted to go along with them to CODESRIA meetings. So even if there are institutions that may be willing, we also need to be alert to those power dynamics within institutions and what it might mean to the character of CODESRIA. Which brings, so we are not saying that institutions cannot be members, but we cannot depend on them to provide this money. So we are going to have to really review our systems and our structures. What can we cut? What can we do using technology? And then also on our contributions. I remember the endowment fund. Some of us paid. Eventually, I don't know whether it was returned, whatever happened. So if we really want to set up an endowment fund, it's not rocket science, it's been done. And we can approach it with a new spirit, knowing what is before us, that we do face, we are seeing the right wing shifts all over in Europe, in our own countries, in the Americas, and it does have implications for us. So I think the question that has been asked is about what would we do if there was no money to fund? We don't think about how we come to the General Assembly, who pays for the tickets, etc. But if it was no longer possible, what would it mean for our institutions? Bayo, I was taken by your launch, operate, and transfer model. And yet, again, it depends. I see some dangers also, but it doesn't mean that we cannot try it. And I think that I was suggesting some of that in terms of the partnerships with different organizations. What is it that we can find like-minded organizations to continue, in some kind of relationship with us, and what is it that CODESRIA itself must do? How can we ensure that this African citation index, we don't even have a manual of style, so you have, people using Oxford, Chicago, etc. All of those come with it, and I think that some of them may not need too much money, and I think we should pursue them. It will also save our younger researchers from these predatory journals that they must publish in together. And I took the issue of the demographics very seriously, and it is related to the wider question on youth. It's no use, Sheila was talking about this deliberate choice. In fact, I had a student who did a PhD thesis on studying to migrate. In fact, you take some particular courses because as soon as you finish, you know that you have a job elsewhere. And it is happening, what Kofi is talking about. Not only in Ghana, there's this talent drive, and we are the only ones left. So these demographics that we're talking about, how do we really deal with it? We know that our policymakers are not yet, they know about it. It's brandished all the time, but they're not doing anything serious. So perhaps the policy dialogue that occurred in the past, but how do we actually produce and also come up with alternatives, because it's not just what you produce, back to the borehole examples, etc. But what kind of alternatives are we coming back with? But it might also, I think that we are going away resolved to hear from the Secretariat on some formats for contributions, because it would be good to launch it and hear that former members, there are people who have money, they could even write CODESRIA in their will, so let's put our money where our mouth is and begin to do something. So there's that existential issue of just the continued stability and existence of the council, and there is also that intellectual agenda, which is dependent, but it can also be separated from it. But we must prepare for it and do something about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the contributions and the comments. I don't really see any disagreement with any of the issues that have been raised. But I just want to say something about the universities. You see, there are a few good examples that we should remember. When UNISA of South Africa decided that the South African intellectuals, university students and others, needed to connect better with the continent, they came, right? Bane Pichana, when he was the VC, and the connections continued later on. They paid for every year to come to every general assembly. They would pay for up to 30 students to come to participate. And so there are other instances in which, I think the University of Johannesburg also came. So the point I'm making here is, it is not only about the money that we should be expecting for them to contribute. Of course, they can contribute. They sometimes co-fund activities when you hold the activities in the places where they're localized. But I think CODESRIA can have a dialogue with the universities that can get them to be interested in supporting or in participating or in getting a partnership developed somehow. And I think that's the figure out. What can they do together? There is something that CODESRIA can bring to the universities that is of value. Otherwise, there is no point in having CODESRIA. We just have to figure out what is it that CODESRIA can help in bringing to these universities, and maybe engage at a particular level with them, which is not it doesn't mean minimizing the importance of individuals in the community, but it doesn't mean that we're going to prioritize institutional membership. But I'm just saying that the continued relevance and leadership role actually of CODESRIA should play out at different levels. And the institutions are part of the community. This is where the people are based. And so if we figure out with some of them what we could do to add value to what they're doing, or to create a partnership that is win-win, I suppose the kind of things that Nuria is saying about how beneficial it has been for her center, CRASC, and the students who go to the CODESRIA methodology workshops. and institutes, how valuable that has been. I think there is something we can work out and that we need to look at more closely and see how that can happen. And with regard to the youth, here in Senegal, you have almost every week boats loading, hundreds of young people, wanting to go to Europe. And what they report, and they capsize routinely. They capsize, half die, 2/3 die. And newspaper reports show that some have been caught, saying that it was actually their 5th attempt. 2 weeks ago, one young person was saying it was his 5th attempt, and he survived it, and if he has a chance, he'll try again. So there's something that has happened. People have lost faith in the possibility of making a living on this continent or a future in the country. So they conjugate future with being somewhere else. And I think there's something that's broken down in the fabric and in the representations of the future on this continent. So if only from a research point of view, I think that's something we should understand better. The big talk about it has to do with poverty or joblessness. People sell all they have. Some had small businesses that were doing quite well. But somehow there's a myth that if you go to Europe or to America, you will make it, And the stories about the people who go to the US through Nicaragua, the minimum budget is $10,000. $10,000, $15,000 anywhere on this continent. If you invest $10,000 properly, you may get something out of it. So I think there is something to understand here in terms of what is happening to the young people of this continent, and because it is. Of course, they are not all seeking to go. There are those who are also, struggling very hard. They are very creative. They use technology very effectively. They want to make a living here. But there is a significant, shift that has occurred, which I think is very important. So I understand the point that Kofi was making. When you have governments actually planning to capitalize on this and developing schemes for, draining more of our resources. And taking them out. I think I like the point about taking almost like an individual and a personal thing, the commitment and the relationships we have with CODESRIA and with the community that we are serving. It's at various levels. It's also with even the diaspora. What you tend to see sometimes, people have research funding, to go to conferences, but when it comes to coming to a CODESRIA General Assembly, they would rather have their ticket paid for them by CODESRIA, and so, but they don't see the value of the relationship with CODESRIA. And I think we've had a lot of testimonies of people saying, one particular, case I will always remember is hearing Eliseo Makamo saying in Lisbon that actually CODESRIA reconciled him with the continent. I don't know whether he's still in the room here, but it was a passionate plea for the work that CODESRIA is doing to be recognized. And I know a lot of people, personally, when I was doing my doctoral studies in Paris, I can't say how valuable it was to get a copy of CODESRIA bulletin, coming at a time when Afro-pessimism, the debate on Afro-pessimism was everywhere. The humiliation you get just watching TV and what you see on TV about Africa. So you get a different story, different narrative altogether, helping you to make sense of the realities differently coming from CODESRIA publications. So I think the diaspora, academic diaspora, see value in the work that we're doing. And that's an important resource to try to work with and get them to make more significant contributions than they're already making. They're making significant contributions. The programs funded by Carnegie, getting African academics to support African universities through CODESRIA, and the Carnegie Fellows program that Zeleza was managing for the time, are all very important initiatives. But I think there's a lot more that can come from it, and they can, also be maybe a link to, the larger diaspora community. And probably one of the things we should be aiming at is to also get some of the remittances to be channeled, to supporting research somehow. But let me conclude by saying that, look, I think we are hard on ourselves. We are very hard on ourselves, and I think that's how we should be. We should not be indulgent about ourselves in what we are doing. But I think CODESRIA has a lot to celebrate. it has been going, and people have been, the stop and go, we've been living with it. Stumbling, getting up. But I think there's been a forward movement, generally speaking. And I think we just appreciate that fully, which is why congratulations, CODESRIA, on this occasion. I think it's very important. At the same time, too, we have huge challenges lying ahead. Huge challenges that we definitely have to find ways of overcoming. And the biggest of which I would say today, in addition to the institutional issues that you raised, Bayo, I think is the funding issue. And the funding issue is, we should make it also a point of talking to our policymakers and then figuring out ways in which part of the public resources available by generation fund go towards supporting research, because it's a public good. I think we should, that should be a battle that CODESRIA should take, and we should never give up in fighting that one as well. Well, let me just say again, thank you very much for what's all here.
Merci, Ebrima. Bayo.
Okay, thank you very much. I see Godwin is here, so it's a good sign that we should be stopping. I would like to align with Takyiwaa in response to Nuria about the AU. And I would actually say that Takyiwaa is even worse than that. It's worse than it in the sense that somehow, although in the transition from the OAU to the AU, there was much talk about moving from an organization of heads of states to a union of the people. What we are dealing with today is actually a situation in which the AU positions itself in competition with every other autonomous initiative on this continent. If you have something like CODESRIA, or African Association of Universities, you would imagine that those would be natural partners of the AU. The AU approach will be actually to create a parallel EU-funded institution, and as much as possible keep CODESRIA, AAU, and such institutions as far away from its work as possible. And we had that discussion. I've had the personal privilege of being on committees that have debated these issues within the AU. It's not going to change tomorrow. The staff, in particular of the Commission, have the idea that the Pan-African agenda is exclusively their monopoly, and they are the only ones who can constitute it. And everybody else must simply line up behind what they are doing. And I'll say the same thing for the Africa Development Bank. I don't know, Mahmoud might remember. It was the time when they decided that they were not positioned as a bank, Sheila should remember, to publish a journal. And we had Africa Development, which is our flagship journal. And they decided that, well, okay, look, better transfer this to CODESRIA. And with the resources. And we were almost jubilant that finally we were going to get, even if in an indirect manner, some money from the Africa Development Bank. And then somebody decided that, no, actually, you know, we're a AAA institution. AAA for the financial markets. It's going to be very risky for anything to come out which has ADB funding that is critical of what we do and that can be sensitive to the markets. And that's where it ended. The ADB, the African Development Bank, is neither African nor developmental. It simply exists on this continent to carry out the mandate of the international financial oligarchs. And it does so with all kinds of instruments. A bank which is supposedly to drive African development, but for which 33 of the 54 member states of the bank are not eligible to get a loan from it because of its so-called AAA rating. So it's not going to happen tomorrow either with the African Development Bank. The Economic Commission for Africa, where we were both there, right, Takyiwaa, It's a UN body. The UN doesn't owe you anything at the end of the day. Yeah, they try to do a journal, but at a cost, ultimately, because it's also, I mean, where CODESRIA started from, EDEP, which was referred to, which I also had the privilege of leading after CODESRIA. I left CODESRIA. EDEP as a UN, Samir Amin ran into trouble for supporting CODESRIA. This story is not very well told, but it's actually one of the big fights that took place, which ultimately resulted in Samir Amin's decision to quit EDEP, because the UN came heavy on him with regard to this. What are you doing supporting CODESRIA? So the UN we are not a priority for the UN. And it goes back to the whole point that we are our own responsibility to the extent to which this institution matters to us. And it has played a significant role in the lives of many of us. To that extent, we must commit and not just have a very casual, opportunistic relationship with the institution, but commit. We call it active citizenship in political science. Be active members of CODESRIA, and that also comes with contributing, demanding accountability, and all of the elements. So, j'ai pas trop d'espoir en ce qui concerne l'Union africaine. For African states, I think there are moments of opportunity that come up. There are some moments of opportunity that come up in which you might find a progressive-minded leader who might be willing to put a lump sum. I would not go for an for membership by African governments, of course. That would render life completely impossible. But if we had a fund into which governments that are willing and progressive-minded are willing to put some money on a lump sum basis and support the council in that way, I think it would be an excellent thing to do. And one way of campaigning for that, which I think it was Georgie who mentioned this, is to, and we've made that proposal before, is to calculate, quantify the host country support from Senegal. We've used it in the past, right? In simply looking at all the VAT exemptions, the tax exemptions, and the payment of the rentals for the headquarters building and so on and so forth, and simply show how much Senegal actually contributes as a way of challenging at least a few other countries that can make a lump sum contribution. But that means also that we build that endowment or a special fund that can ensure that we keep the independence of the council in the work which it does. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Nous venons au terme. Quand je vois déjà Godwin de vous comme ça, c'est vous dire d'arrêter. Et il fait ça de manière très subtile. Alors, nous sommes au terme donc, de cette plénière où nous avons fixé le cap. Il y a beaucoup de défis, mais je crois qu'il y a 50 ans, on était certainement peut-être avec des défis plus ambitieux que ceux-ci. Et que ce n'est pas aujourd'hui que les défis-là vont nous dépasser. Alors, je voudrais encore dire merci à tous les panélistes de nous avoir édifiés pour ce qui est structurant. Et je voudrais demander à la séance d'applaudir beaucoup pour tous ceux qui viennent d'intervenir. Merci. Ah, il faut, pardon, vous savez que, bon, je vais faire comme Marie. C'est comme ça? Voilà, merci beaucoup.
No, thank you very much. Please let us take a 20-minute tea break and then come back for the final session. I can see Therese telling me that she doesn't like it, but I think it's nice to take it. tea break for 20 minutes. I will start the next session at Therese. I'll start the next session at 5:30. And yeah, please.